Welcome to another episode of the Silmarillion sessions, and maybe I should call it something else, a pause-episode, if you will, because today we're going to do something a little bit different. And I can't say pause-episode. I just feel debased, like trying to insert an Anglicization into, which is really a Frenchization, but never mind. As a philologist, we should keep intellectual integrity of the language. Episode is of course a Greek word, so we're going to keep with the Greek prefix for it.
Yeah.
So we're doing a para-episode alongside, right? So a para-episode, or maybe it's a kata-episode, in the sense that it's kind of following down a rabbit trail or something. Kata-episode, Anyway, kata-episodis. Kata-episode, like a catastrophe. It just sort of like happened.
Maybe a Kata-episode.
A Kata-episode. The whole show is a Kata-episode. We're a couple of badass cats ourselves. Can I say that on here? Is that? Because the topic that I want to talk, that we're going to talk about today, because we sort of started hashing this back and forth in our shared Google Drive notes master sheet. That this thing sort of just fell into our laps. We hadn't planned this, but it did, as a catastrophe, that which befell us in the midst of the creation, between the creation and the awakening of the elves. This catastrophe came down and landed in our laps, and we figured we better wrestle this badger.
Yeah, make it a you catastrophe.
That's right. I catastrophe, we catastrophe, you catastrophe, we all catastrophe.
That's right.
All catastrophe. It's like something out of Transformers.
Frequently, yeah.
So, Will, why don't you start us off? What is it we want to do today? What is the big question?
Well, first of all, I had thought about usurping control of the show because, in proper Melkorian fashion, I could play Melkor and just take over the joint, But I figured I continue and let you go. This is Dr. Mikael Thompson. Mikael Thompson? What's your name? You're Cameron Michael.
Cameron Mikael Simon Thompson of Lillebjelke.
That's the guy. And I'm William Joseph Kendrick. And we've been talking so far about the Silmarillion and the developing of the gods, the developing of the creation of the world, the use of light in the story, all this great stuff that's packed into the work. And in proper scholarly fashion, both of us normally have sort of an iceberg approach to our material. Whatever we're doing, we have a huge amount of things that we're studying and reading and listening to, and then we present just a small bit at above the waterline, which is what we put on this podcast. So in my iceberg, I happened upon another podcast, which I thought was a fairly well done podcast. It happens to be called Silmarillion Sessions.
Totally unbeknownst to us.
Unbeknownst to us, started 2 years.
Synchronicity.
Exactly. When we were doing the Hobbit series, they started theirs. It's the two British fellows, and I'm going to hopefully contact them. But in their first episode, they brought up a number of really interesting points about the Silmarillion. And one of the points that really touched me off in a good way was that they suggested that Melkor, on the one hand, might be a representation of Tolkien himself. And they also suggest that Melkor might be a representation of the problem of art and the artist's dilemma, which is that the artist is dissatisfied with this world, and that dissatisfaction prompts him to create a secondary world, right? So in this suggestion, I thought that there's a lot there. And even if I do end up disagreeing with the premise, there's a lot that can be drawn out of that to a great extent. So I thought it might be really interesting for us to discuss that premise and some of the corollaries that come from it. So let me kick off with the easier one, which is the idea that Tolkien is embodying himself in Melkor. That Melkor is the representation of Tolkien. Is that at all legitimate? Is there anything we can draw from it? Is that correct? What do you think?
In a strict literary way, I think no. I think not. For one, he, in some sense, that's a, in many ways, if we understand that in an allegorical kind of way, then categorically now, Tolkien is eschewing allegory more explicitly in the Middle Earth Legendarium, famously against allegory, not against applicability,
right.
symbol in the, many people think today as a more esoteric sense of the meaning of the word, but that's really where he's explicitly, he talks about this in many places. This is a major theme for him. But I think, on the one hand, we're very sort of Dominican with this kind of answer. It would seem absolutely not. That's absurd, patently absurd. And I think that's true. On the other hand, there's a way in which we could understand it is absolutely correct with a very qualified sense. And I think insofar as he, being very cognizant of his own sins and failings as a man, as a person, can see within himself already the battle for light and darkness within himself, as we do with each one of us. In fact, he says as much elsewhere about the sort of the cosmic battle between light and dark is not between these people and those people so much as something that divides right down, cuts between each one of us, as has been said by many other thinkers across time, some closer and some further from Tolkien himself. And I think in that sense, yes, he could recognize his own tendencies towards pride, his own human tendencies towards pride, towards rebellion against one thing or another, his own intransigence, and Melkor represents that in many ways, not just his own, but I think that of not just humanity either, but all of creation. Because remember, for Tolkien, he doesn't live in a world where human beings, it's not just his Middle Earth, but he really believes that the cosmos we inhabit here and now is not a cosmos where the only moral agents are Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens are the only moral agents. He very much believes, and I agree with him, I hold the same views, that there are other moral agencies in the universe. Not only things like, God, angels and demons, but that animals, plants, trees, rivers, mountains, winds can have moral agency to some degree or another. There are other personal beings, and that the material beings themselves are not so separated from us as we tend to think in the sort of post-Enlightenment sense. And so if there are other moral agents, those moral agents are capable of either good or evil. And we see even in the, he illustrates this in Middle Earth, you have various Maya, even the Astari, the wizards, somebody like Saruman, for instance, who start out good and they fall, right? So they're not all sort of created evil or good in the beginning, or they made one choice early on, but that you've got creatures anywhere from Sauron, who falls very early, to Saruman, who falls later, or Old Man Willow, or some of these dark Ents living in the deeps of Fangorn Forest, who are, they're trees, man. It's a tree, but it's an evil tree. Somehow it's got a dark heart, bad right through.
The Barrow-wights.
Yeah, exactly, the Barrow-wights. And so in that way, Morgoth, and the role that Morgoth plays, is we'll see once you get beyond the Silmarillion itself, and Morgoth is definitively banished from the world. He takes on within the in-universe, he takes on the role of a sort of a mythic, just dark evil, right? Hovering evil spirit that finds its influence, its incarnation, its penetration into the world through the actions and characters of other individuals. And so in that way, I don't think he sees himself that way, because if he did, that's a fairly bleak. There are authors who I think probably would, and Tolkien does not read like one of those authors.
Right. Well, this is it not a modern thing to try and find the author in their work? Study, right?
Right. And that's the thing too, is this is actually something that they mentioned in this other podcast series, our British equivalents here, is they did something we failed to do, and that was to identify the fact that the Silmarillion is not a novel. Right? It's
Right.
not a novel. It's a mythic work. It's not even really an epic. There's epic elements within it, but
Yeah.
it's a mythical chronology in the ancient or medieval sense of the word. It's not a novel in the way that we might look at novels and say, well, who is Garcia Marquez in Cien Años de Soledad? You know, and it happens to be in front of me. I'm not as sophisticated as all that. I just go for what's at hand. But the you know, in a novel, it's perhaps easier to say, okay, well, I think the author even subconsciously is projecting himself into the character of Ivan Illich, you know, whatever. But you can't really do that. You can't psychoanalyze this kind of literature in the same way you can psychoanalyze a novel. No, I'm not for psychoanalysis. I know it's very popular in certain places, certain countries, especially when it comes to literary works. But this kind of literary work, it's not the same kind of you're not working with the same kind of thing.
That's a very good point. That's a really good point. It's kind of like judging a symphony based upon, say, the requirements of I don't know, a nursery rhyme. You know,
Right,
it's
right.
really work that way.
Two very different things.
Two very different things. But you know, that modern penchant for psychoanalyzing, as you said, the author through his works, I find it's pretty ubiquitous, but it's also fruitless, because once you psychoanalyze the author, great. What do you do now? I mean, the work is worthless if the author's a jerk or a loser. I mean, and who would pay attention to certain works like T.S. Eliot's poems if you knew what kind of person Eliot was, you know? Or
Right.
it kind of depletes the work itself of power or even efficacy towards the viewership. But more to the point too is, I don't know whether or not psychoanalysis is the end all and be all of analyzing a work. It could be a layer, but to say that,
Yeah.
you know, to say that we are seeing Tolkien in Frodo, or seeing Tolkien in Bilbo, or seeing Tolkien in Melkor, is like to say, well, that's all there is. No, it may be that there is elements of Tolkien in those characters, but that's one layer, many different layers to look at when you're looking at what the work actually means. Dorothy Sayers, his contemporary there in England, who was a great writer in her own right, and she wrote that great series of detective stories around Lord Peter Wimsey and Harriet Vane. And if you haven't read them, read them. But basically, she was asked, do you find yourself in Harriet Vane? Are you Harriet Vane? And she kind of recoiled at the, you know, what kind of question is that? Yes, I am Harriet Vane, but I'm also Lord Peter Wimsey. I'm also Bunter. I'm also the third Duchess of Wimsey's. You know, I'm all characters, because the author is embodying him or herself in all of the pieces of their work, not in one. So there's that. So I don't see. I mean, we could say that there are elements of Tolkien, or we can say that Tolkien, this character would emerge from the mind like Tolkien's, but I don't know whether or not saying that this character is Tolkien is really the right route to go, because it just isn't. It isn't correct.
Right. And I think that brings us to that question: what is the nature of the artistic work? In this case, a work of literature. And Tolkien, of course, conveniently happens to very explicitly focus on this. I mean, as not only an author, but as frankly, as a specialist, as a professional scholar in literature of a certain sort, namely Anglo-Saxon literature, Old English, Nordic, Northern literatures are broadly categorized together. Understands and meditated, whether we agree with him or not. He sought understanding of, he meditated a lot on, he wrote extensively about the nature of the creative act. Not just creativity, but what are we doing when we create a work of literature? And he gives us some very helpful concepts, like a secondary world. So the primary world, level of existence, level of reality, is what we live in. The secondary world then has another layer of existence that exists within that world. It's a world within a world. And you can go deep. You've got, secondary world, you can have a story within the story that'd be a tertiary world, and so on. And that, I think, can help orient us from the outset in thinking about what is the problem of the how do you say the problem of the artist, the artistic problem? What are you doing when you create? What happens not just when you create a work of literature, where you're creating a secondary world, but the relationship then between the maker, the artist, and the thing made, whether it's a work of literature or whether it's a shiny jewel.
Yes, and that's the route that I thought was most intriguing that this podcast initiated in my own. The work you're referring to, just for the record, everybody, the work that Dr. Thompson is referring to is On Fairy Stories by JRR Tolkien. And you can find it, I found it first when I was, I think, 17 or 18 years old in the Tolkien Reader. And by the way, I tried to go back to the Tolkien Reader. My copy is so old, it's actually falling apart. I couldn't read it. I had to actually go and print it up. So, but you can find this online. You know, this is a work that you can find online. It's On Fairy Stories by JRR Tolkien. And the compatriot piece is Leaf by Niggle, which is more like a fictional depiction of what he's getting at with this artistic thing. So along that line, Dr. Thompson, I think it might be beneficial for me to read the questions that came up from this initial kernel of thought. Because I really do think what he's doing with Melkor, and then with Feanor, and then even with the Turin-Turambar, and then later on with Sauron and with Bilbo and Frodo, he's really, and with Galadriel even, he's trying to look, I think, at what the pitfall of this fundamental gift that humans have, what the pitfall really is. Now, that being said, he does say the following in the On Fairy Stories, which I think is important to hang on to as sort of the clue that keeps us from being devoured by the Minotaur of analysis, of literary analysis. He does say at one point that, so with regard to fairy stories, he says, I feel that it is more interesting and also in its way more difficult to consider what they are and what they have become for us and what values the long alchemic processes of time have produced in them. In Descent's words, I would say, we must be satisfied with the soup that is set before us and not desire to see the bones of the ox out of which it has been boiled. By the soup story as it is served up by its author or teller, and by the bones, its sources or material. So really Tolkien suggests that we be very careful when we're looking for the sources or material, like why did he do this or what is he getting at? Have to be careful there that we don't just look at all those bones and not enjoy the soup, which is the effect of the work itself, okay?
Right.
So to look at Melkor as an example of the problem or pitfall of art is important. But when it comes down to it, Melkor is just the bad guy. He's the evil dude. He's the scary opposite that causes all the friction in the work, okay?
Right. And I think that's an interesting, right, there's nowhere in the Einalundale that we actually see Melkor create anything, even in a secondary sense.
Yep.
He weaves a little bit, it's kind of implied,
yeah, right.
But whereas even, especially Aule, we saw just in the last episode, explicitly creating dwarves, things like that. These other Valar had a more of a direct, explicit creation of trees or mountains or something like this. Melkor, it doesn't say, and then Melkor went and created these other things. Melkor took things and just twisted them. It's like he snuck into the toy shop at night after all the other Valar went home, and he just, took a piece of metal and wrenched it this way or that way. We don't have a sense that he's actually creating anything, even in a secondary sense, like an artist would create, or even like the other Valar they make out of the mind of Iluvatar, they make something. We don't get that same explicit connection between Melkor and making something as with the other Valar. So that would be a big point, and in my that counts for me against the idea of seeing Melkor really as the type of the artist gone wrong. I think Feanor is that par excellence.
I agree. He's Melkor is not an example of the artist. Right. I think he is the example of what art sets itself against. It's much like the chiaroscuro that's done in painting. With the shadow that's used is there to enhance the colors of the work, not the other way around. Or when you move a light source around an object, it's in order to enhance the colors. I was reminded, this is juvenile to some degree, I was reminded of our black jelly beans at Easter. You know, the black jelly beans remind you the other jelly beans taste good. You know? Sorry, audience, if you like black jelly beans and I've offended you.
I am a fan of black jelly beans, but I won't take offense at that.
So
it just means more for me.
Yeah, that's right, more for you. I think Melkor is definitely the thing that art is set against, and to that degree, it seems like he does represent a major pitfall that Tolkien is wrestling with. That, you know, as one aspect of the nature of artistic creations and the nature of this gift that humans are given. One thing that does come to mind is how he says in letter 131. And this is the one to Milton Waldman. And at some point, he talks about the fall and the recovery and the machine. Remember that I forget what it is exactly talks about, but he talks about how magic and the machine are involved in this, and that is also brought up in the on fairy stories. So I want that. But before I do, let me go through the questions that did come up, if you don't mind, and I'll just to frame the discussion here that we are having.
Yeah, do that.
First off, is Melkor Tolkien? Are the two synonymous? And I think we've covered it. They're not synonymous, but Melkor is an emergence from the Tolkien mind.
Right.
What is then the nature and purpose of artistic creation? What is the nature of this thing? Does it stem, as this podcast suggests, does it stem from a dissatisfaction at the imperfect and failing world as it is created? Or is there some other source? Does every artist seek to create their own secondary world, their Silmaril, that will not fade? In other words, is art trying to make something that doesn't fade in comparison to this world that does fade? But then, is this our purpose to make art? What is mankind created for? Is art a distraction from that purpose? Does the artist have a tendency to self-justification? By the way, that's a further question. The two are not the same question. So, like, what is our purpose and what is mankind created for? That's one question. The next question, does the artist have a tendency to self-justification? Like, I'm so great because I'm an artist, right? That they're doing so many good things for the world that they need to feed the hungry or clothe the naked or care for the poor, etc. Does the artist tend to get caught in his own thaumatopoi, Plato's shadow puppets or shadow creatures? And I would add, does the artist do this more readily than anybody else?
And just to expand on that word for a second, it's not just the shadow puppets, that's what they are, but thaumatopoi, these are the wondrous things that have been made. That's literally what that means, right? These thaumatos is a marvel, a wondrous thing.
The wondrous, exactly. And art is a wondrous thing, but are they? You know, Plato seemed to suggest that art is shadows, you know, and that they're wrong in that. You know, keeps you trapped. Is two more things? Sorry, go ahead. Good.
Yeah, no. I was like, there's nuance there for those who are following along, whether the shadows are bad or merely incomplete, and how they can be used and so on. But continue. Yeah.
We'll come to
back to that.
It's hard not to go on a Kata-episode here, you know, to go down different holes as we go.
Right. We were trying to herd cats and just keep on in one line.
So, two more groupings of questions here. Is the whole of Tolkien's corpus then, is it largely having to do with this problem of artistic creation and trying to find a way to solve it by going to the very source, you know, the very Erodrin from which it sprang in the Lord of the Rings? Who, after all, is the real hero of Lord of the Rings? Aragorn, who does not create art because his ancestors screwed up that skill so badly. He doesn't seem to be the hero, right? Frodo, whose artistic soul carries the burden to the source, but then he fails at the end. So he's kind of not really the hero. And it seems almost like Sam is the hero of the work. And he's the one who carries the ring in Frodo. And then at the end, he returns to his family. He doesn't go back and say, okay, I'm establish a studio here in the Shire, you know, and paint pictures of the mayor. No, he becomes the all father, you know.
Right.
Yeah. So really, it's more a question of what is the theme that runs through Silmarillion, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, all of Tolkien's works. What is the theme? Is it something to do with this artistic business? Okay. So I'm going to pause for a minute in case you wanted to jump in at all here, because that's a heaping lot of questions that were sparked.
It is. I think we should take them in the order you delivered them, because they seem to me to move from the more general to the more particular. And the answers of the earlier questions will determine the course of our conversation on the latter question.
Right.
So I think we define what is the nature and purpose of artistic creation first will help us more clearly, keep us on, have a clear sense of, who is the real artistic hero of Lord of the Rings, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so on.
Yeah. What is the purpose in nature? And I think this is where, for at least if we can caveat it, what is the purpose in nature for Tolkien?
Right. And because we come with all sorts of other different theories and all that. And this is where Tolkien writes, on fairy stories, very explicitly, or deals with this question. And I don't have it in front of me right now, but what comes to mind is, the very end when he essentially says, what is, in the beginning of the essay, he spends a lot of time defining what is a fairy story versus what is not a fairy story, and how we categorize that genre of literature. With a little shout out to, who wrote Beatrix Potter, Mrs. Tiggy Winkle, one of my favorites. Miss Tiggy Winkle's great. Borders right on fairy story. But he likes it too, so I'm in good company. The ending of his essay, he identifies why fantasy. Now remember, for him, fantasy, there wasn't this whole genre of what we now think of as fantasy novels. It didn't exist. So he's using this in a broader way than what we might tend to think of now, some, frankly, 100 years on, of history of sci-fi and fantasy and all of that in there. He says, what's the purpose of fantasy? What's the purpose of, essentially, I would broaden and say, what's the purpose of art? Because it applies in the same way, is that he talks about this kind of escapism. Yes. And not a negative escapism, not the escapism of the deserter. And I think we've talked about this before, either on this series or on the Hobbit series. And it's not the escapism of a deserter, but the portal, a doorway, a magical doorway, if you will, that can show you the way out of prison. So if you find yourself in a prison, art, so literature, really any beautiful art, or the beautiful itself, however we find it, can be a pathway to out of the pit, to a pathway out of the pit, which actually brings us back around to Plato's idea that we can follow some of the light. If you see the light, you can follow the light. Instead of looking at the shadow of the puppets, you look back towards where the puppets are that are casting the shadow. You move towards them, and then you move beyond them, and you move further and further, and then you're out of the cave and into the sunlight. Right. And seeing things as they really are. I think for Tolkien, the nature, or rather the purpose of artistic creation, or rather a fruit that it bears, is that it can lead to healing, it can lead to salvation, even divinization. That's a theme that he doesn't write prosaically on, but he explores in the fable of The Leaf by Nigel. That's ultimately where he goes with that, is that this painting by the main character named Nigel, there's this sort of complex morality work, but the painting ends up serving as a vital role in the healing and redemption and salvation, the entering into the heavenly kingdom of, into paradise, of many, many, many people long after he's dead. It still serves this sense of inspiring and going.
Yeah, if we're going to say anything, we're going to say that Nigel is Tolkien.
Oh, absolutely. And that's very clear. Could not be more clear that the whole legendarium that is incomplete, woefully incomplete, at the time that John Ronald Reuel actually deceases and leaves this world, departs to the Grey Havens, and the work is taken up by his son Christopher to compile all of these things. And he's recently deceased, and it's still incomplete. There's still unpublished, unexplored things in his work. Is very much Nigel's massive painting of a tree forest scene, and he never quite got around to finishing those mountains in the background. It didn't quite get this branch right, and there's other things that are incomplete because, don't you know, gosh darn it, life gets in the way.
but also he brought great joy to people, you know. So he didn't bring sorrow and misery to people. He brought the opposite, this sort of free. The thing that you were referring to, by the way, in the on fairy stories, he says that there are 4 things that these stories do. If I can list,
please do.
Fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. Fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. So each one he addresses individually, but to sum up, fantasy is this creation of the secondary world. It's basically what the elves do. It's like an enchantment. So he was fishing for a word of how to describe what this thing is, and he says that fantasy seems to be the best word because it's fancy. It's like this imaginative thing. He wants to call it magic at first, and then early in the article he calls it magic, but he does a strange thing with magic where he equates magic actually with the machine, that they're 2 sisters and both of them are bad because they both seek dominance of other people, dominion over other people. But fantasy is what this type of writing, this kind of art does. It creates this secondary world. And he goes on to suggest that any kind of art, not just written art, but any kind of art that tries to draw the reader into a secondary world of life is doing this fantasy business. It doesn't just entertain, it takes you out of yourself and puts you into another world momentarily. And then that relies that relates to the other 3, which are recovery, escape, and consolation. Recovery is much like in the Red Wheelbarrow, you know, by William Carlos Williams, where the ordinary things of life, even something like a wheelbarrow, which carries, you know, dung around, is changed by the nature of artwork. Artwork changes it so that you see it for the first time. It's like you're re-seeing it or seeing it anew. So when we have a work like a fairy story or any great work of art that creates fantasy, it's opening our eyes to be able to see things as we ought to see them, not to see them as they are, which is different. To see them as they are is sort of like just face up to reality, son. That's not what you're doing. You're seeing it as it should be, as it ought to be seen, and therefore seeing it anew as God first created almost the world. Then that recovery of sight or a vision allows a person to escape, as he says, from a world which, as he doesn't say it here, but he says it elsewhere, a world which, to be honest, is actually controlled by the enemy. This is a point which I think it's hard for us to get our minds around. In Christian theology, though, this world is not controlled or ruled by God. It's actually ruled by the enemy. And by that we mean the whole cycles of power and disintegration and despair and sorrow, that's all the enemy. And to escape from that is like the prisoner escaping from the prison, or the captured soldier escaping from the enemy. So that these stories allow us to escape, momentarily at least, so that we are free from the oppression of the soul and the mind that this world tends to draw towards. And the last is consolation. And consolation is reminding us that this is not the end. It's consoling us with the idea that we are loved, we are important, we are something that can do great things in the world. The stories that, like he's talking about, do all these things, and great art does all these things. And just a little bit here, I think what he's getting at too is in direct response to this suggestion that Melkor may be the source of art, you know, that art stems from dissatisfaction alone. Because if we talk about what is the purpose and nature of art, artistic creation, then when we say it stems from dissatisfaction, we are saying that it stems from a negative source, and therefore it is more like a disease on our proper way of living rather than an asset or a gift in our proper way of living. And he says directly that mythology, and by extension you can say art, artistic creation, mythology is not a disease of language. The quotation is this from him. He says, mythology is not a disease at all, though it may, like all human things, become diseased. You might as well say that thinking is a disease of the mind. It would be more near the truth to say that languages, especially modern European languages, are a disease of mythology. Okay, so that's kind of intriguing, because what he's suggesting there is that the artistic creation is not some aberration that we ought to avoid because it's a fungus or a disease. That's part of what we are as humans. We're talking about being made in the nature of image and likeness of God. Part of that is the artistic creation and ability to create art. That's what he's suggesting.
And that fits with what we just covered in the previous episode about Aule and Yavanna.
Yes.
Both in Aule's creation of the dwarves, is that he's, was he creating dwarves because he was dissatisfied? He's Iluvatar's work just can't quite cut it. I want to make something of my own. He said, no, I want to be just like you. You're creating stuff that's really cool. I'm going to create some stuff too. But then even more so with the conversation between Manwe and Yavanna about the fate of how things will suffer does not come from a dissatisfaction with the world as it is, but looking forward to the fact that because there's been the reality of a fracture in the world itself. But it's a fracture in the world. It's not that the world is inherently corrupting and falling corruptible, falling apart, falling to pieces. But rather there's an outside influence, Melkor, working upon the thing that we've all created together, and that's going to lead to some of her trees getting cut down. Is it the case these things will have no way of defending themselves? And she has this conversation with Manwe, and he communes with the thought of Iluvatar, right? And then he speaks to her and says essentially, the trees will be able to defend themselves, and the animals will too. There are going to be some, there's sort of created, or new things are created. The Ents, for example, the shepherds of the trees, come into being to defend the trees. And the creation of it's really out of this conversation that the eagles are born. Manwe sort of speaks so there's this synthesis, this is about as close to a Hegelian dialectic scenario that you're going to get, insofar as you're identifying, as we talked about in the previous episode, sort of cosmic masculinity and cosmic femininity as these two poles, but they're not opposites. They're not, a thesis and an antithesis like Hegel. Hegel just reads things wrong, but that doesn't mean there isn't duality in the world, right? So there's a duality, and you've got Yavanna and you've got Aule. And then Manwe steps in and mediates the thought of Iluvatar. And out of this sort of seeming incompatibility between Yavanna's trees and her plant life and Aule's rocks and metals and everything, she's trying to reconcile this. She's trying to talk to Manwe. He comes in as the arbiter and speak. And here is an interesting thing. Rather than he's a judge, arbiter in that sense. He's an arbiter like a judge, but rather than issuing a command, a mandate or something, settling a dispute, he does an act of creation that now resolves the tension. There's a tension there, and that tension is not dissolved, but it's resolved in the fact that there are certain animals, especially these are the supreme guardian animals, if you read in the context of this conversation, of that dialogue, that there's going to be these massive eagles essentially come in and conveniently save the day, Deus Ex Machina, throughout the rest of the stories, as you'll see. But they're there, and they're created as an answer to resolve a tension that is inherent. But it's not because things are falling apart. We're going to create something as an alternative. And they will be animals, that is from Yavanna's thought, but they will dwell on the high mountains rather than in trees, the mountains, which is from Aule's thought.
Yes.
And so you get creation upon creation to resolve the incompleteness of existing things, but not as an antithesis to the thing. This stuff is falling apart, it's imperfect, I'm going to create something better. I'm going to create something that's somehow different from it, doesn't suffer corruptibility.
Yeah.
And so throughout this whole act of the positive acts of creation, the acts of creation that seem to be harmonious, healthy, in universe treated as good and beautiful, don't seem to be arising to solve a problem or do something differently over and against a corrupted world, but rather to build upon and continue to grow like an illuminated manuscript. These acanthus vines that blossom one out of another until all of a sudden there's a rabbit hunting a knight flowing out of it, because why not? It's just beautiful.
Yeah, it's interesting you should bring up the Hegelian dialect. dialectic too, because on the one hand, I just finished a documentary on the Chinese Communist Revolution, and I was thinking about the Russian Communist Revolution, which was sort of in medias res during Tolkien's life.
Yeah.
I wonder he probably had at least some familiarity with the Hegelian dialectic, because it was in all the cultural.
Very popular in his day, talking about, yeah.
So I wonder whether or not in that whole struggle between Aule and Yavanna, whether he isn't suggesting to some degree that the penumbra of Melkor, if we can call it that, the penumbra of Melkor was beginning to stretch even into the Valar through the created world. Now, this may be a Kata-episode from the Kata-episode that we're trying to do right now, but nevertheless, it does kind of touch on the nature of artwork. Because if, for instance, if that's the case, Yavanna begins to look at Aule's creation as struggle. And when you look at history, or you look at creation as struggle or conflict, it's a very different thing than if you look at it as balance or opposites coexisting. That's a different vision. And if it's constant struggle very seldom has thesis and antithesis struggling together. Very seldom has synthesis. Normally, it's thesis or antithesis wins, and then they dominate and subdue the other. And I think perhaps Tolkien is, again, maybe this is a sort of a commentary on this, that in the realm of the Valar, the solution is not to say, "Oh, Aule, you're right," or "Oh, Yavanna, you're right." It's rather say, we're going to create something even newer, and even a newer thing that's going to be this coexisting of the two. Yeah.
And I think even where you do see, thesis and antithesis arrive at synthesis, there is a new thing, but that synthesis is precisely the annihilation of the previous two poles. They collapse into a synthesis. You can see that in a positive or a negative way. But this is something different. Tolkien is building a harmonious world. So his idea of artistic creation is one of adding note to note upon note to create a richer harmony. And in fact, he explicitly says that's what Iluvatar does in the singing into being of creation, with the Valar, the Ainur all start singing together, and Melkor does his little discordant thing.
Yeah.
He doesn't erase that. He doesn't somehow blend them to make something different. He adds other pieces that now make it even richer and more beautiful without annihilating any of what previously was there.
And it's interesting, he doesn't even annihilate Melkor. Like a lot of people say, why doesn't Iluvatar just go and say smite to Melkor and end that? Because, he causes so many problems later on. But that's not Iluvatar's way. Iluvatar seems to be incorporating even the black jelly beans into the horde, part of the creation, rather than something that he's going to say, we're not going to have any of that. There will be no dissent, right? The party moralis, so there will be no dissent. I think that's far closer to what the artistic creation is about. It's about incorporating things in order to create the secondary world.
Yes, and I think that it just something in what you said just sparked in me the thought that Tolkien, we take all of his works as a whole, and his essays, as well as his actual works of art, his essays on art creation, is that for him, at least the ideal artist, obviously some people where it is in their instance otherwise, but really the nature of art is something that flows not from sorrow or not from dissatisfaction or cynicism, but that art flows from love. You create art because you love. Only the lover can create art. Is something, it would be the summary of a Tolkien's theme on the act of creation, of artistic creation. Very different from, I think, actually, he would say that somebody who's creating something to be lasting because I'm dissatisfied with this failing world, he said, I think he would say that that's technology, that's the machine, that's magic in the, I'm gonna, cast a spell, do a whatever, a magic thing. That's that other sense of magic, like the works of the enemy. I think for him, that's the machine. I want to build it out of steel because that's not gonna rust. Oops.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Your references to Joseph Pieper's great book of Only the Lover Sings,
Right.
that this emerges out of love of what's there. If we're talking about, if we even go to say art emerges out of dissatisfaction, it doesn't really. Dissatisfaction is Melkor, and dissatisfaction leads to not art but twisting of what's already there, or obscuring what's already there, or trying to dominate what's already there. And
Right.
his point, I like his point where he talks about, and this is again on fairy stories, where he talks about that similarity between magic and the machine, because he really actually equates the two. And I probably won't find to actually quote it, but it's really it's a brilliant passage that basically, I hear this, that basically the magician is trying to dominate other people using knowledge or using imagery. Okay, so like somebody who incorporates into their art, if we call it that, a message, right, or persuasive tricks to make you sympathize with the wrong things. That's magic, he would suggest. It's manipulating. If they create art or imagery that only delves into the sorrowful and the miserable and the disgusting and the perverted, that's a form of necromancy.
Yeah.
Or even we could go so far to say that's a form of warlockism. Warlock is like a form of a necromancer. It's somebody who wants to stir up war, division, like a warlock, or somebody who wants to make you into a zombie-like slave. He literally put hands on the dead, a necros mansis. Okay, so a necromancer or a warlock is trying to dominate people using images of misery and despair and sorrow. But the magician is doing the same thing, because the magician is trying to dominate others with knowledge and with images that twist to what he wants rather than what's true.
Exactly. Both Dr. Faustus and Dr. Victor Frankenstein they're doing the same thing, and albeit in different ways. Frankenstein, of course, famously taking actual dead flesh and working something to make it come animated, right? That's necromancy par excellence. It's very much the machine, the industrial thing focused in. And a few generations before, you've got Dr. Faustus. There's a whole history there, but let's just say Johannes von Goethe's Dr. Faustus. You've got him, he's pursuing knowledge. He's obsessed with knowing more. Why? What does it boil down to? Or as C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man cites the same example with Faust. He says, Faust, it says he's pursuing knowledge. It boils down to the three G's: guns, gold, and something or other, right? Guns, gold, and girls, right?
Girls.
And it's getting all that. So it's really power to satisfy his lusts, his desires.
Yes.
And that's how the story begins. That's how Faust begins for von Goethe. Is he's seeking knowledge. Why? But his knowledge it's about transmogrifying not lead into gold, but transmuting knowledge into power.
Yeah. So
in fact, there was those video games in the arcades back in maybe 30, 40 years ago now. Knowledge is power. It's this very Nietzschean spin on things.
Yeah, knowledge is power. So power is the end goal. I mean, that's what Tolkien's getting at here, is that both the magician and the technocrat or machinist,
the technocrat,
they want power, and they want to dominate with their inexorable will. They want to dominate things around them, and that's why he tries to come up with that word fantasy as a sort of counter to this, because that's not what real art's doing. Real art's not trying to dominate. Real art is trying to remind, or to liberate, or to revivify. To refresh, and the word up with fantasy, I think it works really well. It works really well because it really explains, like, he talks about enchantment in the work and how people are in this fantastic world are enchanted by it. That's a way of talking about it, because if you've ever listened to, like, The Afternoon of the Faun, for instance, beautiful piece of music, and you listen to it, it's really enchanting. It's a delightful little piece of music. Or you look at a painting, for instance, that really is a beautiful work of art, not just sorrowful or whatever, but just a beautiful work of art, a landscape or whatever. It's enchanting. It makes you, reminds you that there are great things in the world and refreshing places in the world.
Right.
that you're still capable of great deeds. You're not this decrepit old king of a tired, beaten people.
Right.
You know?
It's like elven song, as we see it in Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
You know, something that's somehow, even if you don't understand the words, it penetrates into you, and it makes luminous your spirit, raises you up. It's not dominating you from above. And so that's why, you know, there's this conversation between Samwise and Galadriel about magic. There's magic and there's magic. You know, you use the same word to describe both the technos of the enemy, what the machine, the magic, the necromancy that he works, and the art of the elves in creating this enchanting thing. And it is, you know, we struggle for a word, and I think that's right. This idea of fantasy and or enchantment is distinct from magic, and it is in fantasy and enchantment is this artistic creation, genuine art. And magic, in this sense, is aligned with the machine, whether you're using arcane powers or you're using metal and steel and gasoline and petroleum, which all boils down to metal and rocks, right? Then that's the machine, right? That's the machine, that's magic. That's this thing over here. And enchantment and art, whether you're using materials or whether you're using weaving spells, that's over here, and that's a different thing. It's the difference between orcs and elves.
Yes, right. Yeah, and it's the difference between wanting to dominate and wanting to help liberate or recover with someone else.
Or even wanting to liberate, the desire to liberate, the desire to change the world and make it a better place could go awry by going for a technocratic solution.
Yeah.
Right. And now enforcing that on the world. And that's that magic. Because, you know, you can do with the Magician's Apprentice. Was it the Magician's Apprentice? The was it Sorcerer's Apprentice? Sorcerer's Apprentice. Yeah. Which has got, you know, people probably know this more from the Fantasia, Fantasia, named you know, Disney musical piece. But you know, you got Mickey making, and this is based on a von Goethe sort of fable too. That you've got the sorcerer's apprentice decides he's tired of hauling buckets of water to go mop the floors, everything. He's going to cast a spell on the broom to make it animate to go and pour water. Well, it doesn't stop. The machine keeps going, right, essentially. And he decides to cut it to pieces. Well, the splinters come to life and they all keep going. So you flooded the whole place, right? Essentially, that's the plot as illustrated by Mickey Mouse and all of this. But you can have something like that, or you can say, hey, you know, our country's really fallen into the pot. You know, society's collapsing. Let's fix the corruption. Let's take an approach and make, you know, have a revolution or build a rational society where we're going to impose industry and reasonableness on people,
or find the source of the problem and then liquidate it.
Right. Exactly. The final solution.
Right.
Yeah. All of this is that dark magic. All of this is that machine, which is very different from creating. So even a good intention, as it were, well-meaning intention, can go wrong.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. This is what he says. If I can quote him again, and I can, because he's Tolkien. You know, he's the Godfather. He says, "Enchantment produces a secondary world into which both designer and spectator can enter, to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside, but in its purity it is artistic in desire and purpose. Magic, on the other hand, produces or pretends to produce an alteration in the primary world. It does not matter by whom it is said to be practiced, fey or mortal, it remains distinct from the other two. It is not an art, but a technique. Its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills." There you have it. That's pretty straightforward.
Well, that's everything.
That's everything. But you know what that does answer too? It does answer this question: is what is our purpose in life? Yeah. I think in this context that he puts forth here in the on Fairy Stories essay, it really puts puts to rest the idea on the one hand that Melkor is the example of the artist, and it also shows that art, real art, fantasy, if you will, is not contradictory to the purpose of human life. It's coexistent to the purpose of human life, maybe even fulfilling in its proper sense to the purpose of human life.
Yeah.
If we are
exactly right.
created to know, love, and serve God and be with him in heaven through helping other people, right, to love our neighbor as ourselves, if that's our purpose in life, then the real artist could be one who does help and love his neighbor by providing a voice or a language that allows them to understand their own imprisonment and escape it. That in that sense, they are doing a service to others, and they are clothing the naked. This is something I've also thought of. You know, you look at the landscape right now in America, especially, and it's naked. That doesn't mean it doesn't have clothes. It's like, it's a wasteland. You know, people don't have a language. The last major language we had to talk about our situation was the Avengers, for crying out loud. You know, it's like, and that's, you know, ouch. That has limited. At least it gives people something to aspire to. But if that's the paragon of what we have, man, we are really naked in that wind. You know, the trees are all cut down, and where do we hide from Satan at that point? But I think that part of a real artist's job is to help clothe the naked in mind or soul by giving them a language, giving them something they can latch onto. You know?
Right. A luminous veil.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And reminding them that they are capable of defeating the darkness, that even at the border, when they see the burning of the city, they still have the potential for blowing the horns and making one last charge. That's important.
Right. Yes. Because it takes an artist to be able to identify and speak into being for us that Théoden upon his horse, seeing that the battering ram smashed through the gates of Gondor, all of a sudden can become Orome of old upon his white steed, riding down into battle. That's what the artist does, especially if you look at some of the ancient Celtic societies. The role of the bard is to connect the divine and the human, to connect the other world and this world. They serve kind of a priestly function to bring these things together into interpenetration, where this guy does embody this higher mythic reality. And that's what art does. Art is that showing of that, is that realization of that. That's why there are battle songs, so that you can become the gods in fighting this. You're participating in Ragnarok, in this battle, that kind of thing.
You're singing your haka.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. And you see, so this is a universal human thing. It's not limited to one end of the globe or the other.
Yes. Great image in that scene too, which may be getting ahead of ourselves, because eventually I do want to do the Lord of the Rings, as ambitious as it is. But there's a great image there where Théoden does slump down in his seat, and he thinks it's all over and I'm doomed. And what is it that actually brings him back to life at that point? It's absolutely amazing. He hears in the city a cock crow, right? And we pass that over like, oh, it's just a symbol of, it just wakes him up. No. Not only does the cock, the chicken, the bird, it heralds the dawn on the one hand, but this isn't a pre-chicken age. This isn't a pre-Purdue chicken age. Okay,
that's right.
We think of chickens as nothing more than something to buy at Target or whatever to have for dinner. But in prior ages, before they were bred to have these great tracts of land that then you could use for dinner, they were birds that were primarily birds that were bred for beauty and for elegant fighting. They were cockfights, and they were given to kings frequently as a gift. It was a royal gift to give a king a chicken, a cock, and really to hear that then is to hear. Socrates says we owe a cock to Asclepius when he dies. We owe this royal gift to the god of healing, because he is now releasing us from this world. And that scene there with the crowing of the cock, the rooster, it's like, this is the divine voice reminding you that the sun is unconquerable, the soul invictus, right? It's the artistic voice, if you will, the muse even.
And that's precisely what you mentioned, because that's precisely the role that the rooster plays in the gospel too. It's
Oh
not just
yeah,
heralding that morning's coming. Oh, Peter, see, you denied me, you jerk. It's it is that divine voice. It's the divine royal
yeah,
call,
yeah. Because Peter
that this
himself,
calling to him.
Peter runs that risk of having the stony heart. If nobody called him out
Right.
on his email 3 times, he would have spent the rest of his life justifying his horrible existence and then dying in, you know.
Right.
And as it was like a blessing because it calls him out and says, "Look, that's not what you're made for. You're made for something greater. I told you that. Remember?" Yeah. And it seems to me, that's the role of the artist. The artist, as Ratzinger points out in his great essay on art, has a very important role in culture because he reminds us of our greatness by wounding us with the arrow of beauty, as he puts it. Wounds us with the arrow of beauty. It's not out of dissatisfaction that the artist creates. Only the magician creates out of dissatisfaction. The artist creates out of love, and by that love, he creates something with them wounds to the heart, those who hear it, so that they're reminded that what they have right now is the possession of the Lord of this world. And they have to escape that because they're made for greater things. Now, that brings us then to the last question, and I think we just have time to just touch on it, I think. The last question then, is the whole of JRR's corpus largely having to do with this problem of artistic creation and trying to find a way to solve it by going to the source? Now, I would frame this question by saying, I think previously our discussion has led us to conclude that art is not a disease. It's not a disease of human life. It's part of who we are. It's essential even. True art is.
Yes.
So what is this? Where does this corruption come from? Is it a tendency that artists fall into and one that we have to be very careful about? And is that what he's writing about then?
It's interesting. I think because the first thing, at least, that comes to my mind, and I think many people's minds, because I like to project myself onto others, that narcissistic complex, or egotism, the our mind, with that question, our mind may first go to like, well, yeah, the ring, man, that's art, and so that's like gotta go, we realize that's gotta go into the fire, and if we think that way, and there are voices in the world, there are people that have said as much, that art is a distraction, art is a cancer that we need to get rid of and focus on the efficiency, all of that, and I think we do that. We see through the whole work of Lord of the Rings, we miss all of the actual art, aside the fact that the whole thing itself is art.
Yeah.
But the ring created by Sauron, I think so. Here's an interesting thing: is you've got the Silmarillion, you've got the Hobbit, and the Lord of the Rings is not actually working towards a climax, the epitome. This ring, this smallest of trinkets of some minor deity, some hanger-on of and he's not even the chief captain of Morgoth, right? Melkor Morgoth. He's just some lesser deity who kind of has power for a while, and he really throws his weight around among humanity and elves, and sort of dominates 1/4 of Middle Earth for a big chunk of history. But he's not the end-all be-all. And it's this little ring that he makes. It's not, Lord of the Rings isn't actually we're not mounting a summit between moving chronologically through these. We're actually just descending from the greatest things to lesser things to the more quotidian. And so when we're destroying the rings, this is why somebody like Tom Bombadil just doesn't, he's just forgetful of it. Doesn't even, it's not a thing. It's just it's a child's toy to him. He flips it up in the air, makes it disappear, poof, whoop, bang, here it is out of your ear, and it's none the worse for it. Because he's bigger than it. But it's a big deal, nonetheless, for those of us who are here. So I don't think that's art. It's in some ways like that's a flimsy piece of technology. The ring is not allegory. It's applicable to a lot of things. But in some ways, something like this, it's a tool, right? It's a tool for domination over others. Even the thing inscribed in it is one ring to rule them all, and in the darkness by it is made explicitly for a purpose of dominating other things.
Right.
Whereas the elf rings, for example, also created. Again, sort of for a purpose, they're kind of a tool technology, but beautiful in their own right. What's done with them is to create beautiful things.
Yes.
So Círdan makes the ships that can sail to heaven after
Yep.
the world is bent and there's no longer a straight path to the happy hunting grounds across the waters. He can make a ship that sails to heaven. Galadriel makes Lothlorien,
Yep.
which itself is a place of what was it? Rescue, healing, and repose and consolation, and all of that. And then Elrond makes Rivendell. All of these are created and sustained with the power of the Elvish rings, which are untouched by Sauron. This is a question we'll have to tackle when we get into the Lord of the Rings itself in the distant future. What does it mean to be touched by Sauron or not touched by Sauron? But we see the Valar make many beautiful things that they don't become necessarily enamored of in the sense of replacing. They don't move things out of the proper order, right? Iluvatar is still up here, and they're creating other beautiful things, reflecting beautiful things. And in fact, that's what the Silmarils are. Even Feanor's creation of the Silmarils is very interesting because the Silmarils, and we'll see when we get to this point in coming weeks, coming episodes here, the Silmarils are jewels that capture and reflect the light of the trees that we just read about, and they reflect the light of the trees. The light of the trees reflects, or is a replication of the original lights and of the thought of Yavanna, which is a reflection of the thought of Iluvatar. So it's this chain of being. There's this hierarchy of lights flowing outward. And we'll see even further that one of those Silmarils ends up in the heavens on the brow of the Arundel. It's a star. And the light from that star is what shines and comes down and fills that little tiny, water bottle of Galadriel.
Right.
She gives to Frodo, and that's the light of the Silmarils, which is to say that's the light of of the trees, the holy trees that poisoned Ungoliant when she bites them. Again, coming attractions. That pushes off Shelob, right? That does all these other powerful things. All of this is art. Are their flowing channels that further penetrate that light into the dark places of this world when all of the lights have gone out.
So really,
is Lord of the Rings about the prop of art? The artist falling in love with his creation, like some perverse Pygmalion, and going awry with it, or is it about something else?
Well, see, you brought up a point here, which I think kind of touches on this, is that on the one hand, we're not looking at the regular story mode or novel mode, which is the increasing tension until we reach the climax and then the resolution. That's not what we're looking at, neither in Hobbit nor in Lord of the Rings nor in Silmarillion. And we're all, taken together, we're not really looking at that. If anything, we're looking, this is the pattern of the world. This is how things repeat. The people in Lord of the Rings are living through one of those repeating patterns, but it's not the only repeating pattern. It's one of many. And to me, that's honestly great consolation. It's the same consolation I get from looking at history. When I look at history, I think, okay, what we're dealing with right now, all the issues that we've been dealing with for the past 3 or 4 years, is one example of a thing that has happened over and over again in history. And it's, to be honest, it's a sort of a small, dwindly form of it, too, because it's been a hell of a lot worse in past generations to some degree or another. So, like the darkness of Sauron is like a gray day compared to the darkness that was cast on the world after Melkor tossed down the 2 lanterns, right? That was horrendous. The Valar fled, and Melkor had all of Middle-earth. Just imagine if you were alive, which you were. But imagine what it would be like. It would be just like you wake up, it'd be still dark. It'd be fires everywhere, a beast waiting to chew your toes off. Be like, that's just not a good day. Middle-earth troubles with Sauron, as bad as they are not that.
Yeah, there's not continents sinking. I mean, even just massive upheaval, like the Earth's crust bursting open and covering the world in lava again. But we're far from that. Far from that.
So it puts it all into perspective. That's one thing. But the other thing too, I think that you brought up, which is that the ring is a tool. It's a machine. That's really that's an interesting thing. As he points out, magic and machinery are very closely tied to one another. And a magician can make things that look like art, but they're not real art. And real art stems from love, not action. And it stems from wanting to liberate rather than wanting to dominate.
Right.
But to some degree, because of their similarity to each other, the work of both the machinist and the magician points to a temptation inherent in art. Okay, a pitfall, as I said earlier, a potential dark thing that could occur. And it's very much, I think, what Galadriel says, I could replace the Dark Lord with myself. Right. And then you worship me and despair. Right. And that, I think, is the pitfall. And so to that degree, I think Tolkien is talking about this, even though the art itself and the idea of art permeates everything. It's in Old Man Willow. It's in the trees there in Lothlorien. It's at the gates of Moria. It's at the Eagles. It's during the last battle. It's everywhere throughout the story, even in the bad parts, because it's all art, right? But the problem is this in the ring image. I think that. I don't know quite how to put this, but so I'll just have to say it out loud. I think that an artist has a unique vision of the world, which is not ubiquitous to all humans. It's not available to all humans. Not everybody can step up and just say, I'm an artist. Right. And that the vision that the artist has to a great degree is the vision that everything is a construct, okay? Because when we look around us, trees, clouds, houses, even human beings we know, to some degree, they are constructs in our perception and how we see them. And most people accept the tree as a tree. The artist says, it may just be cells holding together, and it may just be the tree itself may be only my perception, or the tree could be converted into something else, so the tree is a potential table waiting to happen. So the artist has this ability almost to slip behind the curtain of the normal way of thinking of things. And to some degree, that's good, because he can slip behind and see nuances, and he can see how things could be otherwise. But to some degree, it's bad, because if you do that, you do pass into a world of shadow. You pass into a world that I think is dangerous. It's like in Plato's story of Gygas's ring. Gygas has power to be able to see behind the curtain, but then he uses it to such a degree that he becomes this horrible being, and it wrecks him. And part of Plato's point is similar to what, they're not the same, but similar to what Tolkien seems to be suggesting. The power that's given through the ring itself and through the Numenorian rings and others, the Dwarvish rings, looks as though you are having the ability to see behind the curtain completely and even circumvent the mind of God. That's what it looks like. But what it really is doing is it's trapping you in a thought of dominance, like a perpetual cycle of finding of dominance, and dominating the world. And everything is malleable, and there is nothing secure. And I am the master of everything. I am the magician. That's the trap. So I really think that what Tolkien seems to be getting at in this work, you see it in Feanor and you see it in Melkor to a certain degree, is the attempt to use this innate power to create, not out of love, but out of dominance, so that we end up getting trapped in that void that he brings up originally, rather than continuing on the correct path, the orthodox path that's set down by the creator of this world. I don't know if I'm at all in this. It's kind of hard to...
Yeah. I think that's right. I think it's exactly right. And it's a hard thing to articulate because, I think, because we're human and we live in a world that is fallen, and there's always these challenges. I think in a particular way, in the society we happen to be living at in this brief, moment in time that we call the modern world, swiftly passing away into something else, we lack a lot of the conceptual, the right articulate concepts to talk about this, because we live in a machine we live in a machine age, right? We live in an age that's saturated with machine and magic. And so to see a distinction between that and the enchantment between technocracy and actual art is harder for us because we've got glaucoma, or we've got scales of cataracts, scales of our eyes. And I think one could say, as I'm thinking over the whole of the Silmarillion, is that I don't know. I don't believe that the whole Middle Earth legendarium is about the problem of the artist, or even so much directly about art, though that is a persistent theme throughout, pervasive, not pervasive. But the Silmarillion, I think, could be looked at as, if not totally, at least even principally, primarily, as an illustration of the, let's call it a conflict, but not in a strict sense, but the conflict, the disparity, how about that? The disparity between the right way to approach one's artistic creations and the wrong way. That is, doing the thing out of love and maintaining it out of love and knowing when to let it fade and let go and still love, versus doing a thing, like Fëanor creating the Silmarils, which is what we'll be getting into very quickly here. Loves the light of the trees, going to put that into these gems, great, and then he gloats over them, and then you become like this dragon, you're absorbed in the work of your hands. And I think one thing that's illustrative of this is somewhere in there, and I don't know who is it, Olmo talking to Turgon or whoever it is, that somebody, I'm fairly certain this is in here. We'll see it when we see it, if it's there. But one of the Valar is speaking to the founder of Gondolin, right? The beautiful hidden city. And he's warned not to love overmuch the works of your hands. Because Gondolin too will be destroyed at some point, no matter how much you hide it and defend it. And it's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's a glorious. It provides shelter for many people, and it's a glorious kingdom. But it's not everything. It's not the highest thing.
Yeah.
And so love not overmuch the work of your hands, which is we see that theme again and again. Even Thingol creates beautiful Doriath, but then starts to grasp it, to cling to it, and in that it crumbles.
Yeah.
And these two ways before you, the way of light and the way of darkness, it really seems to be the primary theme. So I think in that way, the Silmarillion, a person could say, is primarily about not the problem of the artist, but about the fundamental decision the artist has to live.
Yeah, I like that. The fundamental decision the artist has to live. And you could extend it to say the fundamental decision that every human has to live.
Because we're all, in that way, we're all made to create art. We're all made to love, and for that love to actually flourish, in the sense of actually produce flowers and blossom.
And not love it so much that we end up thinking that we are the source of everything and can live in our little cave under the mountain with our lake and our fish.
Right.
That brings about bad things, certainly.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so Dr. Thompson, I think we put it to rest.
Yeah.
Or I would say we've planted the seed.
We've planted the seed. We'll see what it grows into.
Exactly. The idea here of the artist, the idea here of where the source of art, the idea here of what we're actually dealing with the Silmarillion, fantastic. I really like it. Do not fall too much in love with the works of your hands. Yes, very much so. To that end, I think we probably should quit it, right?
Yeah, right.
Let it go.
Let it fade at its proper moment.
Right. Good. All right. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lasseter.
Farewell wherever you fare. To your areas receive you at your journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you to where the sun sails and the moon walks.